Good evening, members. This is Tuesday, the 10th of November, Craven meeting of the Craven Spatial Planning Subcommittee. If we could have our roll call first, would you like to do that first, Vicky, or start with the agenda?
Well, the first item is apologies for absence, and I haven't received any. So at this point, can I just do a quick roll call? So if you can just, members, say that you're present, please, when I call your name out. Chairman, obviously, you're present, Councillor Staveley. Councillor Brockbank.
Here.
Councillor Myers.
Here.
Councillor Pringle.
Here.
Councillor Rose.
Here.
Councillor Shuttleworth.
Here.
And Councillor Sutcliffe.
Here.
Thank you. Right, thank you, Chairman. That's everybody. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you very much. Not good of you to all come out on such a horrible autumn evening, but anyway, item 2, confirmation of minutes for the meeting held on the 22nd of September 2020. Do I have a proposer and a seconder, please?
I'll propose them, Chairman.
And a seconder?
I'll second.
Thank you very much. Those confirmed. Item 3, public participation. Do we have any members of the public who wish to address the committee tonight?
No, Chairman, we don't. Thank you.
Very good. Members, item 4, declarations of interest. Do any members have any interest or units? No. Right, I think we would do, but just best to check. Right, on to item 5, the business of the night. Monitoring discussion paper number 1, carbon neutral development. Obviously, this is the first monitoring discussion paper that we're going to be looking at. We possibly may well come away with more questions than answers tonight, so don't be alarmed, members. We're not being expected to approve anything. We're merely here to stimulate the debate and give the benefit of our wisdom to the officers so they can move forward with this. So I believe it'd be Roy Banks that's going to present this. So if you're okay, Roy, I'll hand over to you. Members, I'm sure you're familiar with Roy. He's been with us a long time. You'd like to unmute yourself and take over.
Chairman, if I can just introduce the sort of the general report, and then if I hand over to Roy to actually go through the monitoring discussion paper, would that be okay?
Right. Yeah, stand down, Roy. We'll be with you in a minute.
Not yet, Roy. Okay, so I was going to provide a brief introduction to the item, and then hand over to Roy, as I say, to go through the monitoring discussion paper, and then all the members of the planning policy team are here, and that they would have input into the discussion as well throughout the evening. So the purpose of the report really is, as the chairman has said, is to present the first in a series of monitoring discussion papers, and this one relates specifically to the council's climate change emergency strategic plans theme of carbon neutral development. So members will be aware that back in August, agreement was made that the first 4 monitoring discussion papers would focus on the key themes of the climate change emergency strategic plan that relate specifically to the Craven local plan. So these are carbon neutral development, travel and transportation, land and nature, and carbon neutral energy and low carbon waste. So we will be bringing these discussion papers to members over the next few months. So, members are asked really in terms of these discussion papers to consider sort of and focus around 3 discussion points. So the first one is how existing policies support each theme and the overall aim of achieving a carbon neutral district. So what are the opportunities that our current policies provide in doing that? How existing policies can be improved, so either through updated policies of the existing policies to be updated, or introduction of new policies. So that's where we're asking members really to give us a steer, to have a discussion and perhaps give us a steer as to how the existing local plan policies could be achieved. you know, asking members what do you want what do you want the local plan policies to achieve in terms of each theme. And then thirdly, really, is to identify the evidence that we would need to justify any update to policies or any new policies, because you know, any update or new policies has to be justified by evidence, like the existing policies of the adopted local plan. As well as discussing and looking at sort of limitations that might exist, which are imposed on the scope of a local plan policy. You know, the local plan is only one part of or one method of contributing to achieving a carbon neutral district. So you know, the local plan can't do it all. So there might be some limitations, you know, set by national planning policy, for example, or building regulations. So, you know, it's hoped that this sort of ongoing collaborative working between members and officers will help us to build up a picture of the changing circumstances that are happening in Craven, and provide an opportunity for members of this subcommittee to be involved at an early stage and on an ongoing basis to identify issues that any updated policies or new policies should address. And obviously the work contributes to achieving the government's requirement of the ongoing monitoring review of the local plan over a 5-year period from adoption. And we also hope that this work will feed into any subsequent reviews of the climate change emergency strategic plan. So it's sort of a two-way thing. We'll look at what the local plan can do, but also perhaps provide opportunities or identify opportunities of how that strategic plan could be updated. So I just wanted to just to touch on the white paper proposals. Obviously, we're all aware of what those proposals are, and you know, we don't know what the final sort of reforms of the planning system are going to be. But whether we carry on with this monitoring and review of the local plan, and there's opportunities to either update the plan, or whether we're required to produce a new style local plan, this work will be valuable in either approach, really. So you know, it's a case of it's a process that we'd need to go through. It's a valuable process to identify the issues and the evidence that we need to justify any update or any new style local plan. So if I hand over now to Roy, and Roy's going to just sort of take members through this actual first monitoring discussion paper. Thanks.
Yeah. Good evening, members and officers. I don't want to spend too long doing this, because I think the main point of the meeting is obviously the discussion, and we want to get onto that pretty swiftly. I presume everyone's got a copy of the monitoring discussion paper in front of them. The 2 sides of A4 that we've tried to limit it to. The idea of the paper is that it just provides the starting point for a discussion and the background to what we'll be discussing. It doesn't cover everything, but it provides the basics, and hopefully it's a good launch pad for what we're going to talk about. So section A deals with the evidence base that we have at the moment. 3 main elements there. We've got the sustainability appraisal that supports the current local plan, and that shows how the local plan contributes to sustainable development. We've got the climate emergency strategic plan, which contains quite a bit of interesting information and evidence, which is a supplement to the evidence we have that supports the local plan, because that was produced after the local plan was adopted. And then we have the viability assessment, which was done for the local plan. That provides evidence that the requirements of all the policies in the local plan will not undermine the financial viability of development, and therefore prevent the plan being implemented. Next, section B outlines some of the most relevant policies that we should perhaps be talking about in relation to the climate plan. We've got ENV3, which is our design policy, which includes some requirements for sustainable construction. We've got ENV7, land and air quality, which supports brownfield development and also promotes things like walking, cycling, reductions in carbon emissions and electric vehicles. There are a lot of policies in the local plan which relate to one of the actions under this carbon neutral development theme, 24 actually, that I've been able to identify. That's because the theme, the action CND03, which is lower carbon planning, is quite broad. So a lot of the local plan policies, because they promote sustainable development, also support that action of the climate plan. Next, we've got section C, which just gives a brief overview of relevant supplementary planning documents that we're working on at the moment. Those are guidance documents which supplement the policies in the local plan with a bit of extra detail. We've got the Good Design SPD, and we've got another Good Design SPD, which is the householder development. So the main Good Design SPD will deal with policy ENV3 in particular, and therefore the sustainable design elements of that policy. And the householder development SPD will cover extensions, outbuildings, alterations to residential properties, which will also provide some but more limited opportunities for sustainable construction. Next, section D just gives a brief heads up about circumstances that have changed since the local plan was written. The two main ones being the MPPF, which is now dated 2019. We used the 2012 one, which is what we were supposed to do. That in itself is not a big issue. The main change in circumstances that's relevant to what we're talking about is the climate emergency declaration itself and the subsequent climate plan. The next section looks at monitoring data, which is something that will help us see how the local plan is doing, whether it's having the effect that was intended. And we do that by monitoring facts and figures that relate to the performance of the policies of the plan. The slight snag here is that because the local plan is recently adopted, we don't yet have any monitoring data for the policies in the new local plan. But the next monitoring report will include monitoring information for the first year of the local plan's operation. There are three indicators, as they're called, which are things we monitor, highlighted there. We've got ones relating to sustainable construction for business premises, one for brownfield development, and another for housing on brownfield development as well. We then end up with section F, which gives us a few issues that are arising out of the previous sections. So regarding the evidence base, of course, our current evidence base is all geared towards justifying the current local plan. So if we want a different local plan, an updated one, new policies, then we'll need new evidence, updated evidence to support those. We've got the changed circumstances. As I say, the MPPF isn't really a big issue. That can be taken on board quite easily. But we do have the climate emergency declaration to contend with. Monitoring data, as I've said, the current data we have relates to a period when the local plan wasn't in operation. So we have to wait for that data to come in. And we also might want to look at possibly how we might adjust the set of indicators that we have to maybe monitor more climate change issues than we have at the moment. I think at this point it'd be good to ask Laura Welsh, who's a colleague of mine in the policy team, just to give us a sort of private preview of some of the information that's coming out of our monitoring and is likely to be included in the next annual monitoring report, which might give you some idea of how the indicators are looking for some of the current local plan policies that we have. So if Laura's okay to take over,
Yeah.
I think she's going to give you a verbal update on what the figures are.
Could I just check how private you want this to be for a meeting that's streamed on YouTube?
Well, no,
Well,
not that private.
Yeah.
Or is that just a slip of the tongue?
Well, it's private for anyone who's watching, so probably not that many people.
We're well followed, trust me.
Yeah,
Oh,
the figure
But
is,
it's just a preview of what's going to be in the document when it's published.
yeah, it will be
Nothing
published
secret.
in December. So these figures will be included in the December report, but it's just not finished yet. I'm working on it at the moment. So I've pulled out these indicators ready for tonight's meeting, and the rest of them will be done in time for publication in December. So were these circulated around to members earlier on? It's just again 2 sides of A4. It's from the 2019-20 Authority Monitoring Report. So because we monitor completions over that year, they're all completions on applications that were granted before the local plan was adopted. So again, we're using new indicators, but it's not really monitoring the effects of the plan because they were granted against the older policies. But I'll just go through them quickly. There's EC2, which is the total amount of employment floor space by type on previously developed land. So of the 4,020 meters squared net additional employment floor space that was completed over that period, 78% of that was on previously developed land. And then there's a breakdown table there which shows the figures in more detail, but that's the key, is that we're still achieving a lot of development on previously developed land. For the housing, which was completed on previously developed land, we had a net additional 281 dwellings completed in 2019 to 2020. And of those, 170 were on previously developed land, which is 60%, 60.5%. And for the developments, the non-residential developments of more than 1,000 metres, which meet the BREEAM very good standards, we had 5 completed that were over that of that size, and only one of them sought to achieve a BREEAM certification. Again, these were permissions that were granted before the policies were in place. The one that did include details of how it would achieve BREEAM, it didn't say, it just said it aspired to achieve certification. It didn't say what level. And that was a development that was part of the Broughton Hall estate of business premises. Since the local plan was adopted, we've had one detailed planning application approved, which was a non-residential development of over 1,000 square metres. And that was the Council Depot Engine Shed Lane. And that one did achieve BREEAM very good on that application. Like Roy was saying, we can change the indicators as we adopt different documents to reflect the aims of those policy documents. There'll be policies within the climate emergency strategic plan which might have indicators for. So if we think of something else that we want to monitor, that we feel like we should be monitoring to get evidence, we can include that in the AMRs without having to get approval. The AMR, the indicators which are in the current local plan were approved by the inspector at the examination, but we can amend those and add them if we need to without having to get approval from government. It's our document, a local document, so if we think of something else that we'd like to start collecting, as long as we have the data available to collect, we can do that in subsequent AMRs. So I'll hand back to Roy now to carry on with his presentation. I'll mute myself.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Right. So maybe before I get onto the discussion points, I'll just briefly point out what the appendices to the monitoring discussion paper are. I mean, we did keep the discussion paper itself to 2 sides of A4, but I'm afraid there are some lengthy appendices as usual. Appendix 1, sorry, A, just really sets out what the relevant actions are under the climate plan's carbon neutral development theme. The ones that are relevant to the local plan, that is. Appendix B is quite a long table which shows all local plan policies and how they support the climate plan. And then the final sheet, Appendix C, is a suggestion as to how additional actions could be put into the climate plan to reflect some of the things that the local plan is doing, just to make it a bit more complete. Okay, so now on to the discussion points, finally. We've got 3 that we're suggesting to kick things off, but obviously there's absolutely no need to limit the discussion to those 3 points. And you might not even want to discuss these, you might have some other ideas. But first one is the existing policies that we have in the current local plan. How do these support the theme of carbon neutral development from the climate plan? And importantly, how can they be implemented to achieve the optimum results now without having new policies in place? So how can we best use what we already have to the maximum effect? Then second discussion point, future policies. How can the existing policies be improved to better promote carbon neutral development? And then, as Ruth was alluding to, the requirements for those policies and the limitations imposed on those policies, particularly by national policy. You know, how far can we actually go with a local plan towards carbon neutral development? And that's it. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Well, members, let's see. I'll start with the existing policies. We may as well take the structure that's been put in front of us. If members have got any questions, suggestions, or comments to make about our existing policies as they see it, please come forward, and hopefully we'll be able to get through the meeting without mentioning the Litchfield report. But anyway, Councillor Brockbank seems to have her hand up first, so I'll start with you, please.
Thank you, Chairman. There were some times during the presentation that I would have liked to have asked some questions. So may I ask those now?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, go
on. First of all, the document that was sent to us this afternoon on the AMR indicators, there is the reference to the BREEAM certification. I do remember the applications that these two that are referred to in here, the 2 applications. And when we were considering those, we had to, or I asked questions, but we had to ask the question as to what BREEAM ratings those applications or the buildings were being built to. It just said that they were to BREEAM. I think it would be useful to members of the planning committee if we had some information in the officers' reports that told us what the BREEAM ratings were. If we're aiming for higher BREEAM ratings, is it very good? Is very good the highest one? And we're aiming for very good. Am I correct there? On all developments.
I can say you can get excellent as well. Very good isn't the highest.
Right, but are we aiming for very good then in our in any of our any buildings in Craven?
If I could answer that, Chairman. The policy, ENV3 policy of design, has a section on it called sustainable design and construction. And the first sort of criteria in that subsection of the policy does require non-residential development of over 1,000 or more square metres where feasible to meet at least BREEAM very good standard. So that's for non-residential buildings. So that's the policy requirement, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, but we had no idea when we were considering this report of what the standard was and of what the standard was that it was going to be built to and what the standard was required by Craven District Council. Do officers, the planning officers, know what our requirements are and what how are they going to insist on those requirements? Are they just advisory or are they mandatory as far as we're concerned? So, for example, if an application comes in and it's not going to be built to the standards that we want, is it automatically going to get rejected?
I think perhaps if I could try and answer that. You know, the obviously ENV3 is clear in what the standard is, that to achieve that very good standard for BREEAM for non-residential proposals over 1,000 square metres, you know, that the wording of that is that where feasible that should be achieved. So if it's not feasible, then the emphasis is on the developer to show why it might not be feasible. So that would have to be justified, and then that would be assessed as part of the development management process and by the officer assessing the planning application.
Okay, so we've committed to being carbon neutral by 2030, which is only 9 years away because we're nearly at the end of the year. That's not very long. And if, for example, and I'm quite, how can I say this in the nicest possible way? Developers need to make profits, and the pressure is on them to make profits, and so it may well be that some developers will find reasons not to reach the standards that we're asking, and that's one risk. And what I wouldn't like to see is that we find ourselves perhaps 5 years down the road now, from now, and only 5 years away from our carbon neutral target, and we have a shortfall of buildings. So of buildings that comply to the higher standards. So that, I think that's going to need monitoring, going to need careful monitoring. But I can't see that we can or even should make it mandatory. Because the risk is that if developers can't make sufficient profit or the profit that they want to make, then they're not going to want to come and build in Craven. It's fine if everybody else in the country or in our area has the same standards, but if it's only us who has those standards, are we putting ourselves at risk of not being able to meet our housing targets and our employment targets. So there's going to need to really be some careful monitoring and some early action if we find that we're not on course. For that, I would like to see in officers' reports for applications, I would like to see what the BREEAM ratings are. And that isn't, I haven't seen that yet. Then going on to the other, onto the main report, monitoring of data. Who is going to be overseeing that? Will it be, for example, spatial planning? Who is going to ensure that any action that is necessary, that needs to be taken, who's going to make sure that those actions are taken? Who do you envisage oversee, which committee, which members committee do you envisage overseeing the monitoring?
Perhaps if I can
You
come
don't
back
need to
on-
answer that now, sorry. You don't need to answer that now, but you know, it's a consideration that you know, we may, if we do find ourselves that we're falling behind, is there going to, what action is it going to be? We're doing the monitoring, but are we doing any actions? Have we got any plans for producing an action plan and making sure that those action, who's going to be tasked with those, that action plan, who's going to be responsible for making sure that gets through?
I mean, I think if I can just come back on that.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ruth, do you want to come back on that? Because I think the Councillor Myers would also like to comment. I mean, are you okay waiting, Councillor Myers, or do you think it's relevant to speak first?
No, Ruth, go. You go. You might be saying what I was going to say.
Okay. Well, I was going to say that the, you know, under the current system that we've got, there's this requirement. The government has the requirement to monitor and review on an ongoing basis planning policies, so the adopted local plan, and that's what this these monitoring discussion papers is part of that process. Another part of the process is the authority monitoring report that we produce every year, and the idea of that ongoing process is that we build up a picture of anything that might have changed. For example, the climate change declaration is a key one. You know, other national policies that might have changed, and together with sort of highlighting those, as well as the authorities monitoring report, maybe highlighting how the performance of policies and whether any policy is not performing the way it should be. Then over that sort of 5 years, so it's 5 years from adoption, then you build up we build up a picture of those changes. And then at the end of that 5 years, then we produce a sort of a concluding report, if you like, to say, well, after doing this work for over that 5 year period, these are the issues that, or we feel that the local plan needs to be updated to address. And then we go through that phase, that process of actually updating parts of the plan or chapters of the plan, or it might be all of the plan, I don't know. But this process that we're starting now is will achieve that. So I think that's the key thing, really, that it's sort of an ongoing process, that you know, the combination of these monitoring discussion papers, that we have these discussions with Craven Spatial, and producing the authorities monitoring report, which are the facts and figures of how each policy are performing, and we discuss that with Craven Spatial. Then, you know, over that 5 year period, then that picture will be built up that we can then report on and make that public, and then start the process of updating the plan.
So it's Craven Spatial Planning that will be the monitoring body, if you will, as far as members are concerned.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. The 5 year thing worries me a bit, because in 5 years' time, that would leave us 4 years in order to achieve our target, if we went on target.
Councillor Brockman, I've just got Laura indicating to speak. She doesn't know how to use a virtual hand, Laura.
Sorry, I've got a real hand. Yeah.
Go on.
I was just going to say the AMR, these indicators are used annually and we report on them annually. So if things need to change sooner than 5 years, if we find that the BREEAM standards aren't being met, we can take action sooner than that. That one of the core things that the AMR should do is to identify where policies aren't being used or met and take action. So we don't have to wait for the local plan to be reviewed to do that. We can work with development management to highlight that policy is not being used to its intended purpose, and point it out to them and try and work with them to get it raised at pre-application stage and try and encourage it to be put in place more with developers. And also your point about if it could be included in the officer report, that would help me a lot, because at the moment I have to look through all the application, the whole application forms to see evidence that the developer has provided about the BREEAM, and it's usually in the design and access statement, but I do have to do quite a lot of digging sometimes. If that could be put to them, and then I'd appreciate that as well.
Or even perhaps it could go onto iDocs, onto the planning database. If there's a place on there, and then you could just search on it, and you wouldn't have to manually look for it. You know, there's some sort of tag could be put on there. If there's a spare field somewhere.
I have a sense that Councillor Myers, in his newfound role, may well have something further to say about this. He was about to speak before. I sense he may have a comment to make.
Well, it don't need to go round the houses too much on this. I mean, Councillor Brockbank, as far as your concerns about whether any policies that we enforce more rigorously or higher standards we impose impede development, we'll be aware of that as a council fairly quickly. We don't need to wait for reports from spatial planning. We know about that very early on. And in the same way that we know about houses that are and aren't being built, housing targets that aren't and aren't being met. So as a council, we know. Planning committee, that's what we mean. Planning committee does not make policy. We make policy. The planning committee that make planning decisions as they happen. I see no harm in the suggestion. It's not the only suggestion as to what might in future be in reports. And I think there needs to be a discussion between Spatial and DM about that, and I think there has to be more communication, because there's no point in us having these policies and us talking about them and us recognising as a council how important it is, and saying as a council that we're concerned about climate change emergency and we've set these targets. It doesn't filter down to everyday analysis carried out by planning officers. There's no point. So we need to make sure that everybody's on the same page as far as using the policies we have to try and meet our aim, developing further policies. But we need to know that. So yeah, I think we can look at all that and better communication, definitely.
Right. I've got Ruth waving vigorously at me, so I'm assuming that she's got something to add to that. I've also got Councillor Rose indicating to speak, and then we've got David Smurthwaite. Councillor Rose, could I beg your indulgence and ask if David can speak before you, because I have a sense that he may have something to contribute to what's been said, and then we'll get on to your own point. So Ruth, David, and then Councillor Rose.
No problem.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, we are planning, the planning policy team and the DM team are planning on coming together and sort of doing workshops, if you like. And the first sort of workshop is what we're suggesting is on this issue of climate change and carbon neutral development, and to work with DM to discuss how policies and the policies that are linked to achieving this carbon neutral development are implemented and interpreted. And so that's something that we are planning over the next few weeks. So hopefully, you know, and as we go through these different monitoring discussion papers and we talk about different policies, then, you know, that's something that we were looking to sort of carry on and do with do these sort of workshops with development management. Just in terms of sort of the viability of development, obviously I think we've touched on it before, but all the requirements that are in the local plan now in terms of, you know, affordable housing and open space contributions and education and all of them, you know, a key piece of the evidence base was the plan-wide viability assessment, which tested all those requirements to ensure that, you know, that development, that having those requirements in the plan doesn't make development in Craven unviable. So if we updated our policies to introduce new requirements, for example, for to do with carbon emissions, carbon neutral development, then that would have to be tested as well, and we'd have to have that a plan-wide viability assessment done to any updated policies. You know, again, with the same aim that to ensure that if we introduce any additional requirements to the ones we've already got, then it's not going to make development unviable in Craven, and it's going to prevent developers coming in and actually developing.
David.
Yeah, I just want to make a point about the importance of the local plan on climate change. And clearly it is a vitally important tool, and this plan is a big step forward to what we had last year in terms of when we didn't have a plan. But it is not going to deliver, even if it's fully implemented to the letter and the spirit, it will not deliver zero carbon Craven. The 4,000 houses we're going to build is dwarfed by the 28,000 which are already there, emitting carbon things, Victorian back-to-back sort of thing houses. You know, that's where the issue. So it's vitally important, and we may in the next plan, I think we probably want to take it further. But it on its own will not deliver climate change, well, zero carbon by 2030.
Right, thank you. Councillor Rose, thank you for your patience.
No problem. Thank you, Chair. I have to confess, I feel a little uncertain about the difference between the policies. We obviously have to have policies. We have to have policies that are reviewed and updated and respond to change. And we have to have policies that set out, you know, the background to everything that's done through the District Council. I appreciate that. I'd like to go back to something that Councillor Brockbank was talking about, was ultimately it's the developer, isn't it? We can have beautiful policies, we can have them monitored, we can have all the data reviewed, everything can be tip-top. At the end of the day, it's the developer who ultimately will build the house or the industrial unit, and we want them to be carbon neutral, and we're setting out a format for that. But as Councillor Brockbank pointed out, you know, can we enforce that? And if we can't enforce it, developers will just go somewhere else, or will build shoddy stuff that isn't carbon neutral. Do you see what I'm getting at? I'm just very concerned that ultimately we want to have good building. Can we enforce it? Can we make sure that every single house that's built is sustainable, that every single bit of industrial building unit is sustainable? It worries me a great deal that can we actually enforce these policies that we are putting together with a great deal of thought and expertise. I take my hat off to members of the officers who are working on it. But ultimately, will it work?
Right, I've got Councillor Pringle, and I think Councillor Shuttleworth isn't actually swatting a fly. I think he's indicating to speak, although he's forgotten to use his virtual hand. So we'll have Councillor Pringle first, and then we'll have Councillor Shuttleworth. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to the officers for these reports. Thank you for the things you've sent us this afternoon about Lichfield, which I will not talk about tonight, because that's for a different day. And thank you for the stuff about sections 106. That's for future debate. 4 or 5 members of today received an email from another councillor who represents the Green Party and has some good ideas about carbon neutrality. Are you guys happy if we forward that email to you and ask you to look at it with a view to deciding whether or not the recommendations in it could be taken forwards in any amendments we do make to our plan in the 5-year review? So can a member who's not a member of this committee, via some members of this committee, me and possibly others, put forward some suggestions to you? Please, will you look at them? That's point 1. Is that answerable?
Well, I mean, I think any member is allowed to make some sort of representation as a member of the public. You know, anybody can make a representation to this committee. I'm aware of the quite a substantial wish list that was sent through to us, and I think in fairness to the relevant councillor, he maybe doesn't quite understand to the degree that we do how the process works, but nonetheless, you know, as I say, some very reasonable and fine suggestions, and I'm quite sure it's not too much to ask that those are to be considered as well, so we can pass those on to Ruth's team. As I say, Councillor Brown would have been more than welcome to go along in the public participation. But anyway, right. Next.
I beg to differ because councillors aren't allowed to be public participants. But, so thank you for that. As far as I'm concerned, I've read it all, and it comes down to sort of existing policies. I'm really glad to hear that Spatial are going to talk to development control. That's got to be a brilliant first step forwards, because sometimes it appears that the 2 departments haven't been talking. What's in the plan doesn't seem to be what's in the officer's report. So that's a great step forwards. Thank you for that. But when I look at it really simply, what I'd like to try and achieve is, we've declared that we want to be carbon neutral, and we have an existing plan. And it's how are we going to change that existing plan to make it more likely that we will be carbon neutral? And this goes back to the previous meeting where I said, can we get somebody here, either an officer or somebody external, who will explain to us all what we can ask a developer reasonably to do? Is it solar panels? Is it ground source pumps? How are we going to do that? Because by the time it gets to planning committee, and we sit there right at the end and say, well, why is there no solar panels? It's too late. This needs to be done from the start as part of our plan, and a developer needs to know that if he does solar panels and if he does ground source pump, we will look more favourably on his development than otherwise. I don't know where the, and probably where the force comes in and where the encouragement comes in, because obviously whether it's a condition or whether it's a section 106, but we sort of need to come up with a plan as to how we're going to get from where we are today to these houses we're building being carbon neutral. And to be honest, we're all looking at each other. We need somebody to tell us, and if we haven't got an officer to tell us, yes, every house should have a solar panel on it, we need somebody who can tell us, because I don't know the answer. I'd love to know it, because I don't want to sit in the planning committee and pass an application where, like we do at the end, Andy Brown says, oh, shall we make them put in an electric charging point? Well, that's what happens now. So can we think of a way forwards to get from where we are to where we want to be? And if there's nobody sat around here tonight can do it, please can we get somebody who can point us in the right direction? Thank you.
Right, Councillor Shuttleworth next, and then I've got David Smithwaite again. Sorry, Councillor Myers, and then I've got David Smithwaite again.
Thank you, Chairman. I wasn't swatting flies. I'd just lost the participants button to be able to raise my virtual hand. Anyway, I found it again now whilst Councillor Pringle was speaking. Yeah, I want to echo the concerns of Councillor Rhodes. It worries me that we can write policies and prepare and have approved plans. The problem, as I see it, is enforcing those provisions. We've got a problem already with enforcement of, shall we say, straightforward applications. And this is creating another burden. And it's all right making policies and saying, this is what we're going to achieve, this is how we're going to do it. It's ensuring that those aspects are met. And I think we ought to just think a little bit wider, or at least refer those concerns to an appropriate further committee or ancillary committee to recognise and all work together, because otherwise, we're not, quite frankly, we're not going to get too far. I have an awful lot of, shall we say, and it's in the nature of my mind, technical issues, which I think could be very usefully implemented to help achieve the carbon neutral status. But without that, a lot of them are in effect concealed and should be monitored, or construction should be monitored on a regular basis to ensure compliance.
Thank you, Councillor Whitworth. Councillor Myers.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Well, a few things really. I'm grateful to Councillor Pringle for raising Councillor Brown's submissions. I'm afraid I haven't had time today to go through the various policies line by line and check his amendments against them. But I would like the officers to look at them, and we can all look at them in due course. I also agree with Councillor Pringle, and I believe that David Smith will have something to say about this, that we could do with some expert input. And I think David may have some ideas about this. And we need it from a couple of reasons, really. One is to see what is the best way that we can use existing parts to achieve our aim. And secondly, to inform our future policy. So I think if that could be arranged, that would be very valuable. It's essential as part of our commitment to carbon neutrality by 2030. We can't do it without experts. Rob Eskin is very, very good, but he himself, he is not an expert. So let's get that going as part of the review of this part of the local plan. The other thing I would like to, and it's really jumbling all the, but it may just save a bit, is how we can use building regulations, which we have some flexibility on, to better achieve our aim. And I think that again would be helped by, we can demand higher standards. I understand them, national building regulations to a point. As David Smurthwaite says, we can't solve the problem of our contribution to ameliorating climate change simply by using these policies and building regulations, because we have most of our housing stock that wouldn't fit new standards. And we have to pursue other policies to ameliorate that. But we must do what we can to ensure that new built properties adhere to our plan. And as far as Councillor Shuttle is concerned, and Councillor Rose, yes, enforcement is very, very important. But the first step is making sure that DM that planning officers reflect our policies in their views of application, because there's no point in having enforcement. We're passing things that shouldn't be passed or that should be made to adhere to new standards. First of all, let's do that. And yes, we must look at enforcement. We are committed to employing more staff in enforcement, and we'll review that again when we get the peer review, I think at the end of the week. But so I think all those aspects that members have mentioned are very important, and we need to get on with it. This, we're not going to sit back and wait. We need to be starting this now.
Right, thank you. Councillor Myers and David Smurthwaite, and then Councillor Brockbank, please.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, a lot of issues there. I think Councillor Myers is right in terms of the first step is about DM implementing what the policy says, and we need to ensure that happens. And then again, it's then also about building regulations. Building regulations are essential in terms of implementing actually the building standards. And so it's about the inspection of that. But that's, I don't believe that we're asking at present anything above the national standards. Whether we want to do that differently, that's a thing to consider. I think in terms of Councillor Pringle's points, I completely agree. We're talking to Leeds Beckett University and about their, I'll get his title wrong, but he's something like the Doctor of Sustainable Planning, Town Planning, or something like that. We're going to invite him to come and speak to all members, so you definitely, but to try and broaden it wider so that everybody can have an input. And what we're asking him to do is be challenging to us, so that if we want to go for zero carbon, what actually can a future local plan look like, and what are the options? And there may be things that we don't want, but we want to have that debate and be challenged by it. We're also discussing with the left about setting out what the scale of the challenge is, because actually to go from where we are now to zero carbon is a big step, and I think we need to know what that scale is. And also talking to Alan Dawson, who's working in our building control, who's also a lecturer at Leeds College on building control, to look at wider about what can be done, what people are doing elsewhere, so we can get a better understanding of what's possible. So hopefully those three, it'll give a good blend of what we're doing now, what we need to do in the future to start to shape those things. And if you can send through Councillor Brown's comments, that would be brilliant. And then I could feed those through to the professor or doctor or whatever he is, to sort of say about the type of things that we're looking for, and because he's wanting a steer, so I'm hoping to get a steer from you this evening to set for him what we want him to do.
All right, thank you. Councillor Brockbank, and I've got Ruth, and I've got Councillor Sutcliffe. So, Councillor Brockbank.
Actually, I don't think Councillor Sutcliffe has spoken yet. So if he wants to speak first, I'm happy to go after Councillor Sutcliffe.
That's very gracious of you, Councillor Brockbank. It does worry me slightly that you're going to be spending quite a long time talking. You're letting somebody else go first. But anyway, as you wish, Councillor Sutcliffe.
Oh, that's very magnanimous of you, Councillor Brockbank. Yes, it perhaps is relevant because I want to support Councillor Myers, who has recently spoken on this. I'm all in favour of the idea that we use the building regulations and improve them to achieve our long-term objective. But I'm not quite sure, and perhaps David Smurthwaite can comment on this, how we deal with the fact that building regulations are a national document, not a Craven District Council document. And in fact, 80% of developers don't even use our building control department. They use self-certification. So it's to some extent, whilst I support Councillor Myers' objectives, I suspect that David Smurthwaite will tell us that it's not entirely in our control. And if we were to impose, for very good reasons, a higher standard of building regulations, then those developments that are self-certified, they would simply go to appeal to effectively request to be released from the more onerous regulations. So I think it's all in a good cause, but perhaps David Smurthwaite could comment on how we achieve what we want, bearing in mind that 80% of developers are not using our regulatory function anyway. Thank you.
Councillor Sutcliffe. Ruth, if you'd like to go next, then we'll let Councillor Brockback go.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, in terms of sort of how, you know, a key thing, and the first discussion point really is that we're looking at now is, you know, how can the policies we've got now be implemented to achieve the optimum results now, and that's linked back to what Councillor Pringle was saying. But there are limitations to that, obviously, that we've got the policies we've got, and there are certain requirements set out in those policies. You know, but we can't introduce anything new until we actually go through that process of updating the plan or preparing a new plan. So we can't introduce any new policy requirements overnight, and you know that may be frustrating. But in terms of what our policies aim to achieve, and they either have set out requirements or they encourage certain standards to be met or encourage certain type of developments to be achieved. It is linked very much to, in terms of carbon neutral development, there is a strong link between the local plan policy and building regulations, which we've touched on. And from the sort of research that I've done, I'm not an expert in building regulations, but in terms of the research I've done, authorities can set a higher energy performance standards than building regulations and require that as part of a local plan. And there are lots of, or there seems to be quite a lot of consultation that the government has done fairly recently over the last few years, that propose changes to building regulations to require higher levels of standards. But none of them have actually resulted in any change to the building regulations from what I can see. So there is a lot happening, and the white paper, for example, does refer to something called a standards housing review, which relates to sort of open space standards and accessibility and water efficiency, and it's that is promised to sort of be finalised by sort of the autumn, which is now. So there does seem to be a lot of consultation that the government has done on this, and obviously the building regulations process is a separate thing to local plans. So if things change in terms of building regulations, then you know, those are requirements that have to be met. And it's my understanding, David Smith will correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, whether that's done by a council building inspector or an approved inspector that's outside the council, it's still a national, they're national standards, building standards that have to be met in all buildings. So I think, you know, there's a lot of things happening, but in terms of what, looking to see how we can use our policies that we've got at the moment to the optimum to achieve carbon neutral development, we do have to be careful that we and recognise that we can't introduce anything new in terms of local plan policy.
Right, thank you. Brockbank, you.
Thank you. A couple of comments I have on the document, the second document, Appendix B. Oops. Bear with me while I scroll through. Page 5, H2, affordable housing. We had, I've been talking to one of our members, and he raised, which apparently he's had some emails between you, Ruth, and himself regarding disabled people and affordable housing. And on our page 5, H2 affordable housing, we have a policy CND 03, which says support improvement of existing affordable housing stock and reuse of empty homes. Improvement and use of existing stock homes reduces the need for urbanisation of green land, of field land, and so reduces net carbon dioxide emissions. This isn't the forum for it, but in our policy, I forgot. I'm sorry. I've got the email here. I can find the policy that it refers to. H1, our local policy H1 on affordable housing. It talks about affordable housing for elderly people, but not for disabled people who are not necessarily elderly. And that's something that I think is a shortfall. And I don't know how we will pick that up or where we can pick that up. Is this the right forum to pick that up? But it certainly is an important point that not all disabled people are elderly. Not all elderly people are disabled. So that's my comment on H2, which isn't really relevant to what H2 is saying. But on EC1, the next 2 down from that, EC1, it says policy supports employment and economic development in specific locations and circumstances. Oh, sorry, no, it's not that one. Sorry, it shouldn't be there. It should be against the H3 gypsy travellers. And it talks about the reduces the need for day-to-day car use and requires new extended sites to have access to local services and employment. It would be nice if we could mention their education as well for Roma families, children of Roma families. That's just a nicety to have. EC4 tourism, what have I said there? Oh yeah, EC4 tourism on the next page ensures access to public transport, footpaths and cycle routes. My comment there about public transport is, I know we've said this many times before, that Craven District Council isn't responsible for public transport. And the answer is always, when we've raised that, the answer has always been, well, North Yorkshire County Council are sympathetic towards our local plan. But it's just a comment really that we keep saying this about public transport, but we have no control over it. And the more we can, more pressure we can put on North Yorkshire County Council to improve our public transport, that would certainly reduce the amount of cars that people in Craven have to use. They can use public transport instead. And then INF1, policies on planning obligations or Section 106 agreements themselves, and set out how they'll be used. Oh, that's a discussion on 106s. That's not relevant to what we're talking about at the moment. And scrolling. That's it.
Right. Thank you, Councillor Blockbank. David Feeney sat quietly there. What would you like to say? Unmute yourself. There you go.
Yes, thanks, Councillor Staveley. I just might like to make a few points, please, regarding a few issues that have come up. First of all, in terms of working with the policies that we have now, and particularly in relation to policy ENV3 and criterion T, which is very relevant to this evening's discussion. We are looking at the elements in criterion T in terms of practically achieving carbon reduction techniques within buildings, and particularly within residential buildings, but also within commercial and employment buildings. And these elements include, as is specified in criterion T, the reduction of energy use and carbon emissions, the minimization of waste when buildings are constructed and also in pre-construction plans, and finally, the reduction of water use. And all of these reductions in water use, waste, materials, and energy use contribute greatly to the reduction in carbon emissions. And as Ruth has said earlier, we'll be working with development management in the next couple of weeks to talk through practical techniques in each of these areas so that carbon emissions can be reduced in new buildings throughout Craven, so that there are practical solutions to what is put forward in criterion D to promote innovation and knowledge and awareness from developers. Because as Councillor Rose has said earlier, we can have a fantastic set of policies, but we need the buy-in from developers in Craven. And indeed, we need the buy-in from residents throughout Craven in order to move progressively towards a zero carbon approach over the next 10 years. Also, I wanted to just contribute to an answer regarding BREEAM that Councillor Broadbank mentioned earlier, please. You mentioned, Councillor Broadbank, about very good ratings and where that sits in the BREEAM rating benchmarks. Well, very good, as Laura said earlier, is not the highest BREEAM rating. There's also outstanding and excellent, which are above very good. Very good in this case corresponds to the top 25% of buildings in terms of advanced good practice. And the reason we've chosen very good in criterion S of policy ENV3 is because it is impractical from an economic viability viewpoint of a developer to ask for excellent or outstanding BREEAM ratings. And if a developer got their building up to a very good standard in terms of advanced good practice, it would already be a significant improvement on the standards of many residential buildings as they are currently being constructed. So that's why we've aimed for very good in terms of a BREEAM rating benchmark. And also, as Ruth has indicated earlier, there is a lot going on both at government level in terms of maybe changes to the building regulations to promote more carbon emission techniques and good standards. And it can be said that our policies do match up with the latest building regulations, and maybe there will be improvements in building regulations and associated governmental documents so that eventually our policies in future can go further in terms of carbon emissions. But also, what is also happening at the level of Craven and Yorkshire is that recently, on behalf of Craven District Council, I attended a meeting organised by Northern Power Grid, which relates to what are called local area energy planning networks. And they enable stakeholders led by local government to interrogate different energy futures for an area and to develop the most promising cost-effective options for decarbonisation. And in that context, there's a lady called Katie Prevet, who is a low carbon officer at the York and North Yorkshire LEP. And she's in early discussions with Rob Atkins and I believe also David Smirthwaite regarding implementing such a local area energy network for Craven District Council along with other councils in the Yorkshire area. So there's a lot of movement going on behind the scenes to try and promote carbon reduction at all levels throughout the district, but also throughout the region as a whole. And that's the few points I wanted to make at this stage, Councillor Staveley. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. We've got David Sykes next. Unmute yourself, David.
There we go. Thank you,
You're
Chair. Good evening, everyone. It's just in direct response to Councillor Broadbank's issues raised. I think, unfortunately, a lot of those are new elements to policies, basically, that we can't really deal with in terms of the monitoring of the existing plan. They will be issues that you'll have chance to raise when the formal review takes place. But on a more positive note, although policy H1 doesn't refer to younger disabled and their needs, policy ENV3 I does refer to the needs of all users, all occupiers of buildings, and so therefore is inclusive of disabled, and it seeks to ensure that there is reasonable and appropriate accessibility within those buildings. So that's a positive note just to end on. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, my own observations. We're talking about the existing policies that we've got, and a lot of it, sort of the ones that have been highlighted, it sort of seems warm words, but it does come off as slightly sort of well-intended, aspirational, woolly nonsense. It's not going to be the direct sort of big hit that we need, in many respects, it seems, to get the carbon reduction that we need. You know, we're suggesting about, you know, use of public transport, which we all know is not particularly well catered for throughout our district. You know, encouraging cycling, things like that. You know, it sounds nice, but is that really going to make Craven carbon neutral? You know, we as has been discussed, you know, we do need to be very much more specific and proactive. So I do worry that we maybe convince ourselves that we're going in the right direction with the policies we've got by throwing in a few catchphrases and taglines, but it doesn't necessarily translate, I'm not convinced it does, into a substantial reduction. I mean, you know, we're talking about Roma and traveller sites so that they can be closer to work. I mean, including the title, the travellers, that's the whole point. They travel, they want to travel. You know, that's the nature of their work. Just one example, I'm picking on it because Councillor Brockbank mentioned it, but yeah, I do feel that we have to be a little bit more assertive in what we're looking at. And as I say, if there is a way of putting more meat on the bones of these policies that we've developed, then maybe that's what we need to do. As I say, whether it be through building control or through amendments or interpretation of these into the development management process. But yeah, I am a little concerned that this isn't going to be the key to things in terms of the bigger carbon neutral picture. I mean, developers, we talk about developers being asked to do certain things. I mean, we are in this rarefied position where, because of the value of housing and the demand for it, and commercial sites for that matter in Craven, it is attractive for developers to build here on the whole. If the cost of development in Craven is increased because we demand higher standards, well, is that not going to come off the land value? You know, I'm quite sure that the developers will always seek to get their pound of flesh one way or another. And while we've got terms like where feasible floating around in there, which seems to me to be a blank check for them to sort of start picking away at whatever policies we're trying to put into place, we are going to be always trying to fight the uphill battle, it seems, that we get when we start talking about affordable housing, for example. It's like a get out clause. So yeah, I appreciate the work that's done and everything, don't get me wrong, but we've got to be a lot more prescriptive about this. And yeah, you know, sort of I don't know, bring the big stick into play because otherwise, you know, a development of new housing in Craven isn't necessarily going to yield what we're maybe hoping it is going to do. That's my sense as a, you know, a layman councillor. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the subject matter. I've got Ruth and I've got Roy speaking, so I'll take Ruth first, and then I'll take Roy.
All right, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I suppose trying to be raise a positive note is that, you know, Appendix B to the monitoring discussion paper, you know, it's highlighted in the policies are highlighted in yellow that that actually do help to contribute towards achieving carbon neutral development. And I hope members would agree that there's quite a lot of yellow in that Appendix B. So there are quite a lot of policies that we have that do help to achieve that. You know, obviously, like Councillor Stave was just saying, some of the wording might be, you know, it could be stronger. But, you know, obviously, if that's going to happen, then we need the sort of evidence to be able to back that up to make that you know, a stronger policy, if you like. But I think, you know, there seems to be sort of two aspects to this, and one is from what I'm getting from members is, you know, one key thing that you want to do is to have a look to see how we can implement the policies we've got now, you know, to really do as much as they can do in the way they're written to achieve carbon neutral development. And then the second sort of arm is to see, you know, how policies might be updated on, what new policies we could come up with. And, you know, David Feeney sort of talked about policy EMV3 that does include, you know, the wording of it, criterion T, does include, it says that sustainability should be designed in so that development takes all opportunities to reduce energy use, water use, carbon emissions, minimize waste, and where possible generate power through solar or other means in accordance with building regulations. So that criterion of that policy sort of encompasses quite a broad range of different techniques to try and achieve carbon neutral development. So I suppose, you know, the question really to put to members is, you know, should that policy be separated out? Should you know, an update to policies or a new plan introduce separate policies that relate to those issues separately? You know, we talk about in EMV3, which is the design policy, which encompasses quite a lot of issues. There's a section on sustainable design and construction. You know, should that be separated out into a separate policy, for example? So these are the sort of questions that we might not be able to answer tonight, but you know, that we perhaps need to look at in more detail and to get a steer from the subcommittee really on how, you know, that the policies we've got do contribute to a certain extent, but then, you know, how do we want those to be changed? And you know, that could be one option, is to try and separate out the sort of the requirements of the existing policy to sort of beef them up a bit and focus on specific techniques and methods to achieving carbon neutral development, and that would link to the building regulation requirements and how they may change.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the point, Ruth. I mean, I feel that we have to be bold with what we're going to put forward. We have, as I say, we have to be prescriptive. I have got every faith in the development business to be able to turn a nice profit out of middle-class gilt tax that will be attached to carbon neutral housing. I am quite sure that if we demand a higher standard, that will no doubt be reflected in the value of the housing. And maybe you could argue rightly so, because if you've got this nice new shiny house that's got very, very low running costs, surely in the grand scheme of things, that should be factored into your decision as a householder as to what you buy. You know, do you get a drafty Victorian terrace or semi, or do you get the latest up to the minute technological advanced carbon neutral house from your friendly developer? As I say, yeah, we need to be bold. I've got Councillor Myers and I've got Councillor Brockbank.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. I really agree. We are going to have to be more specific in the policies when we come to update the local plan. But I think building regs will, in due course, follow that if the country is to its aim. Radical. Certainly, it seems extraordinary to me that housing developments of any scale could go ahead now without some thought to geothermal heating, centrally based or something like that. It just seems ludicrous that we're not learning the examples of our cousins across the North Sea who have this and have had it for many years. So yeah, but I think that's what we're going to need to work on, and I think any expertise we can get into that, so much the better. I rather agree with the chairman. When we judged those REBA designs for new affordable housing in the national park, I looked at these fantastic, light, airy, carbon neutral, easy to heat houses. I came back to my wet, damp, leaky farmhouse. But wouldn't it be wonderful if it fell down and I could build something like that? Yeah, I think they are very attractive, and there's no reason that new housing shouldn't be economic, attractive, allow developers to make a profit and be carbon neutral.
Right, thank you, Councillor Myers. Councillor Brockbank.
Thank you. Just one final point. Picking up on what you were saying about the middle class guilt tax. It's fine if you're middle class. It's fine if you have a job with a good income, or you have a good income. But we do have the employment in Craven. A lot of it is quite low paid, and we need housing, cheaper housing. I won't say affordable. I mean cheap, because people think of a particular thing when I say affordable. But we need housing for people who can afford. People on lower wages can afford to buy, and it concerns me as well that some of these policies that we're putting in place, that we must make sure that we don't just end up with high-end and medium income housing and no housing for people on lower wages. That's my final point. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brockbank. Just the point about the middle class guilt tax, as I put it, I don't think we should be under any misapprehension here. Craven is not a cheap place to live. It never is going to be. But do remember that if people have lower household bills, maybe household costs for bills, maybe that mitigates some of the extra cost of actually having a house here. But anyway, right. So I don't think we've got anybody else. So we could sort of move on to the next discussion point, do we think? David, would you like to speak? David Feeney.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Councillor Staveley, regarding a couple of comments in the chat about social housing built to decent standards. There's no doubt that as investment from developers and the private sector goes into renewable technology in homes, both social housing and more general housing stock can all be built to decent, affordable housing standard using renewable energies. It doesn't have to be a battle between cost versus implementation of new renewable technology. Once governments government take the lead in terms of future home standards, building regulations and so forth, and provide the incentive for private industry to get on board with renewable energy, costs start to come down very quickly. Thank you, Councillor Stavely.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, yeah, certainly, you know, I'd love to see, you know, if we build housing estates of a certain size, you know, if they have some form of electricity generation, it should be the same for all the houses on there, including the affordables, perhaps even small scale wind, or just say, as Councillor Myers has mentioned, something underground even. We have, I suppose, looking at the structure that's discussed initially by Roy, we are sort of touching on future policies to some degree, but can we, have members got any specifics for future policies that they'd just like to go over if they haven't already, just to be sure that we've covered that base, because obviously we have talked quite a bit about what we'd like to see, and I suppose you would say that that is future policies. Any comments, members? Okay, well that was underwhelming. Was that David, and I've got Councillor Shuttleworth and Councillor Myers as well, so I'll take David and I'll take Councillor Shuttleworth and then Myers. Thank you.
I was just going to try and spark a bit of conversation. What I've spoken to Leeds Beckett up to now, to say, asking them to think wider in the sense of planning. So it's not just about the building or the house that you live in, it's about the society and the community that you live in. So it's only about, I'll probably get the figures wrong, but it's something like 20% of emissions come from your house. There's about another 30% which is from your transport, where you go to work, where you buy your products from, and so on and so forth. So it's looking at much wider in terms of the spatial distribution and things like that. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to look at, and you say it's not just whether you have a solar panel on or not. It's about the community's relationship with the car. How do you reduce car usage? Things like that. There's lots of things which there's potential for. Need less tires.
Careful what you're saying. I like cars. Actually, David, you make a very valid point here, because our local plan that we have only just adopted was defined by the world that we lived in last year. The world that we are living in this year, and will probably continue to live in some form or another going forward, is very different. As you quite rightly pointed out, the relationship with the car is very different now in transport and our workplaces and how we get to work or don't, as the case may be. So I think obviously we're discussing future policies. Yeah, things have changed. Maybe we should be less concerned about bus routes and more concerned about information superhighways, or whatever you want to call your broadband nowadays. Right, so Councillor Shuttleworth, Myers, and then Rose, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. You've touched upon something I was going to raise, thinking about what we might put in our policy in the future, and that's making improved provision from working from home, both in terms of communication and at the same, in one stroke, it would reduce the need for more or a greater level of motor transport. Don't look like that at me. It's
You're picking on cars. I don't like this.
Oh, that's it. There's a personal interest here, is there? Right. Okay. Yeah. No, it was amazing, the reduction in road traffic when we went through lockdown 1, and that can only be a good thing in terms of reducing carbon emissions and reducing the levels of atmospheric pollution in other respects. So that's one point that I would, well, throw into the mix to consider anyway. The other point, and it's just because of my background and the way my mind works, it's a technical issue, to encourage timber framed housing, which significantly reduces the level of cement required in construction. And cement production is one of the largest processes turning carbon dioxide into the air. Now, I know we don't have any cement industries local to Craven, but there is one just over into Lancashire. And I think it might be a good selling point to minimise the incorporation of Portland cement in construction and use or encourage the use of timber in various forms, both in the structural framework and other aspects. And also where mortar is used, to encourage the use of traditional lime mortar, which in turn, as it's maturing, absorbs carbon dioxide from the air. That's not created much of a reaction, has it?
Well, I'm just thinking, I'm just going over the story of the three little pigs in my head, really. But yeah, I think you actually make a good point, though, Councillor Shuttleworth. That, I mean, have we got scope for embracing new or rediscovered technologies in terms of building regulations? I think that's a very valid point. Is that the sort of thing you're aiming at?
It was, but not. I think it might be difficult to incorporate it in building regulation. It might be something we could encourage developers to use those sort of revised specifications in their construction. I'm not quite sure how we could do it through, well, I don't think we'll be able to do it through building regulations because they're a national base anyway. Just how far we could go down the planning route to require that sort of construction. Worth thinking about.
What was the question, Councillor Shuttleworth? I mean, we don't know that we can't do it through building regs. We don't know we can, through any other means, but, it's worth asking the question, isn't it? So I think that's a good point, well made. If that's everything, Councillor Myers, please.
That's as much as I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Myers.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I was going to say, I quite agree with David Feeney that the costs of all this will come down considerably once government puts its back to it. I think it's very, very important. And it was one, I know we all, well, certainly some of us felt it was one of the things lacking in that we always consider that affordable housing is not social housing, and we need social housing. And there are people who are never going to be able to buy houses, however the purchase is constructed. So we must always have that in mind. What I was going to really say, Chairman, was that it's lovely chewing the fat with members of an evening, and us all coming up with ideas that some of which and some of which perhaps a bit off the cuff. I'm really keen that we get better informed and that we take advantage of David Smurthwaite's suggestions to have some degrees of expertise put into our discussion, rather than us floundering around in a rather amateurish way. So I would suggest that we wait till we're better informed, the officers are better informed by some expertise as to what we can use current policies for, how we can use building regs to the best of our ability, and how we should look at a local plan going forward in terms of achieving our aim. So I'd like David to get on with that, and then I think we can discuss matters when we're better informed.
Yeah, good point, Councillor Myers. I'd still think that tonight's useful just to sort of get us all thinking about how we would like to tackle this debate and what we think the problems. I mean, as I say, we are amateurish because, by Christ, nobody would pay us for this, would they? So I've got Councillor Rose.
Thank you, Chair. I did actually have the opportunity to go through Andy Brown's suggestions, looking at how local policies might, the future. Following what I've learnt this evening, some of these obviously are not necessarily going to work, but if anybody does have the time, to look at it, any of the officers, it might be just a little useful exercise. Now I've learnt the difference between very good and excellent for BREEAM. Obviously, one of those goes out the window straight away. But I just found it a useful little think. And I do appreciate that it's a bit time consuming, but certainly thinking ahead with respect to policies. If anybody does have a time and a cup of coffee to go through it,
Well,
a bit useful, but obviously some of it may well be just not possible. As I say, with BREEAM, first run won't be.
no, that's no problem, Councillor Rose. I did actually go through this morning myself, and Councillor Brown is time consuming, you're right, but he made some very good points, and I think they'd be well worth taking forward. Ruth, you were waving at me.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah, I haven't seen that email, but we're more than happy to have a look at that as suggestions, and and in terms of coming back to members with sort of additional evidence that we might need in order to achieve those any of those suggestions. The additional work that might be required to back up any policies, any new policies or updated policies that reflect those. Then we can report back on to members on that as well. So yeah.
Thank you, David. Unmute yourself, David.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Councillor Staveley. I'd just like to answer what Councillor Shuttleworth put forward a few minutes ago regarding carbon emissions coming from different methods of construction. And absolutely, cement that contributes to concrete production is one of the biggest generators of carbon in the Western world, really. And only ahead of that is glass production. So this is where there's a very nice symmetry between what Craven has in terms of traditional building, because stone building in Craven is one of the lowest generators of carbon emissions overall throughout the construction life of the building. And also, as Councillor Shuttleworth said earlier, timber is a very, very good method of introducing a very low carbon product throughout the construction phase of a building. So certainly there's elements there where in construction, carbon emissions can be greatly reduced at that crucial phase of construction of the building. And we're producing a good design SPD in the planning policy team at the moment, which puts forward all of these ideas and puts forward innovations in terms of practical, technical innovations to support reducing energy use, minimization of waste and water use once the building is constructed. And I believe that such innovations and spreading knowledge among developers is the most practical way of implementing what we have now in terms of policies, particularly policy ENV3, which is most relevant to the discussion tonight. And as Councillor Myers rightly said earlier, it's now about trying to, in my opinion, get the best approach in conjunction with the current building regulation standards and how best to work with those as they stand presently, as Councillor Myers has indicated earlier, and also other government work in terms of the future home standards and so forth. How far can, I believe that we have all the content in policy ENV3 and related policies to implement and push forward innovative solutions and techniques for homes and employment buildings throughout Craven. We just need to see how best to work with the building regulations to put that out in the best framework for developers and members of the public in Craven going forward. All right, thank you, Councillor Staveley.
It will come as a pleasant surprise to the quarrying industry of Craven that they're actually producing something environmentally friendly, but anyway, it comes as a shock to some others. Right, Councillor Sutcliffe, please. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, it was just this issue that Councillor Shuttleworth raised, and the possibility of adopting new methods of construction for house building, with the resultant less use of cementitious products. And I don't know if he's aware of it, but Scottish building regulations for many years have been different to the English building regulations, and they are in fact a lot tighter. And in consequence of that, as a major supplier to the house building industry, I do know that in Scotland, 85% of the new domestic house building industry is timber frame, compared with 15% in the UK. And that simply is developers recognising that within the framework of the Scottish regulations, they can come up with a quicker method of construction, which allows them to complete the inside before they even finish the outside. But that example in Scotland could quite easily be emulated in England if central government was prepared to alter the building regulations more akin to the Scottish ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sutcliffe. Councillor Shuttleworth, over to you.
Yes, I was just going to add to that, that timber framed construction lends itself very well to modular building, which further increases the speed of erection of the structural frame of a new building, which again is something that developers might well latch onto and not be as hindered by the weather certainly in this part of the world, to turn over the to actually increase the rate of meeting housing targets. I think it's a question of salesmanship more than anything, that we've got to talk to developers and encourage them, if we don't have the legal means to do it, to certainly show them the advantages of adopting a reduced Craven, reduced carbon policy.
Absolutely, Councillor Shuttleworth. I mean, I'm quite sure that the economic benefits, because of the speed of construction related to timber frame, has always been attractive to many developers. Obviously, the bigger the scale of the site, the bigger the benefit there. But yes, I think we're taking forward. Have we got anybody else wishing to discuss this specific point, or can we move smoothly on to the final point? Is about how the Craven local plan can influence actions of climate emergency strategic plan. Well, that certainly silenced the room, didn't it? Any offers? Anybody wish to? Yeah, right. Thank God for that. Yes, right. Over to you.
The rescue.
Absolutely.
Well, I think really the answer to this question is provided in the Appendix C of the discussion paper. It really just points out that there are some things in the local plan policies which promote carbon reduction, which could be transferred into the climate plan as additional or modified actions. And I think we could just send those to Rob Atkins, and I think he's already indicated to us that he'd be happy to receive any suggestions for improving the climate plan, and that it's sort of a living document almost, that it can be updated as and when necessary. That's it.
Thank you, Roy. Well, I'm assuming that members are happy with what we've read in there, because of course you have all read your papers, haven't you? Because nobody's commenting on it. So I think, yeah, absolutely, that's would seem to be a sensible approach to move that forward. There's nothing else that members could think they would like to add to that list there that they may wish to put forward. Roy, back to you again.
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned when I was talking earlier that one of the suggestions does relate to building materials, because the policy we've been talking about, ENV3 on design, it does say that materials should be locally sourced wherever possible. And of course, locally sourced materials have a smaller carbon footprint because they've been transported for fewer miles. So if we were to encourage the climate plan to use locally sourced materials wherever possible, including on council projects, then that would be an enhancement of the climate plan, which has been informed by a policy of the local plan.
You're really banging the drum for Craven quarrying tonight. Anyway, yeah, I think that seems sensible. Councillor Rose. Somebody's got something to say. Thank goodness for that.
Thank you very much, Chair. Brownfield sites, they obviously are a good thing in the sense of making use of brownfield rather than greenfield sites, and obviously should therefore be encouraged. There is also the issue of possible contamination and the fact that it can be expensive from the developer's point of view, tidying up before you start the build or the renovation or the conversion. So one would wish for any brownfield site to be used whenever possible, but it must. I'm just conscious that a developer may look at a brownfield site and say is not going to be financially viable because of possible contamination, or it's too tricky to do a conversion of a mill into fabulous apartments, whatever. So it's laudable, but is it always possible to encourage developers to use brownfield sites? Would be my concern. Thank you.
Anybody wish to come back on that?
Yeah, I just think that obviously, you know, the sort of the types of development of brownfield sites over the last few years in Craven, particularly the mills. I mean, nearly all of our mills have been converted. So, you know, that in itself is sort of evidence to show that it's not a constraint to development, that, you know, that's happened. And also I think the indicator information that Laura shared before about brownfield development being was it 70-some%, so, you know, it goes to show that the brownfield sites are being developed, and yeah, some might be contaminated and some might have high costs in sort of in terms of sorting that out before any development starts, but you know, in our policies, and we're very clear that any sort of those costs need to be factored into you know, the cost of the land and the overall cost. So you know, I think generally you know, brownfield development has come forward at a strong rate in Craven.
Right, thank you. Right, so I think it's fair to say that we've done this bit to death, haven't we, really? Councillor Myers' suggestion about getting some further instruction in what's possible would seem to be a logical way forward to further inform our debate and try and teach us a thing or two about what we can and can't do. It certainly would help us as we sort of move forward. So I think at that, we will call this agenda item closed and move on to agenda item 6, which I believe, Ruth, we need to have a discussion about affordable housing consultation response, don't we?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, yeah. So this was just relating back to the members will recall that back in August, the draft affordable housing SPD was presented to this subcommittee, and it was approved for public consultation. And in that report, it stated that the final SPD and the consultation statement and other associated documents would be reported to Craven Spatial for information. So in terms of the preparation of SPDs, members will be aware that the terms of reference for Craven Spatial allows the subcommittee to approve drafts up to and including a draft for public consultation, which is what happened. So therefore, policy committee is required to actually adopt the SPD. So what I was suggesting is that, given that statement in the report that came to you in August, that we would circulate the final SPD and the consultation statement and the adoption statement to members of this subcommittee for information, and that will be done at the same time that the papers would go out to policy committee, so that you have them for information, rather than it being presented to an actual meeting of Craven Spatial. So it's whether members agree with that suggestion.
Thank you. I mean, certainly I myself, if any members of this committee feel they wish to make comments, as is the case, we are entitled to lobby members of the policy committee with our views. Obviously, our membership of this committee may add weight to that argument. It may not, but nonetheless, we can make our views known. But it's worth saying that it will not be the view of the Spatial Planning Committee. It will be the view of an individual member. So I think on that basis, I'm quite happy to accept the proposal. Do we need to have a vote on this, Alex, or are we okay just to gently nod our heads?
I think it could just be done by consent, Chairman.
Right, thank you. If you've got any objections, pipe up now. You've got 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, I'll do. Fast. So I think on that, date of the next meeting. Now, unless we've got anything specific, have we got some sort of time frame, David, when we can sort of drag some soothsayer in from Beckett University to tell us how to be green?
I think the biggest challenge would be just getting us together. I think because it'd be via Zoom, so he'd be fairly flexible. So it'd be really an opportunity where you've got a clear space. So I'll speak to Guy and Vicky and just get a time. But if we aim for something like, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah, sounds reasonable to me. Sooner the better. For myself, Councillor Myers, in your lead role, have you got a view on this? Yep, there's a thumb going up there. That looks good.
Yeah, let's crack on. Need to crack on. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Any other members got any comments on that, or telling us that you're leaving the country for a month or 2 that you won't be able to attend? Or no, none of us are leading that sort of exciting a life. Quite clearly, that's why we're here tonight. So I think at that we'll await confirmation of our next meeting date and pass that around, members. Call tonight's meeting closed. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you, officers, for your time and patience with us and your reports. Much appreciated. We can do it all again just as soon as we can.